Should we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I feel like I'm alone a little bit with this microphone. It's always complicated to perform with things of this sort. Kind of uncomfortable for me, but I'll try to do my best in this show. Okay, so initially the title of this presentation was different because as the research was evolving, I actually, as a team, we realized that what matters here at the end of the day for this particular research is the number of cannabis stores and whether that eventually will have an effect in our outcome, which is traffic injuries, crashes, or fatalities. Okay, so the title is, did the cannabis recreational use law affect traffic crashes outcomes in Toronto? Building evidence for the adequate number of authorized cannabis store thresholds. I will skip this because actually Robert mentioned the effects of cannabis consumption on driving overall. But there is some kind of nice pictures. You see a dog kind of enjoying himself. Also, you see that the distortion of time, that will affect driving. All right, so, I mean, how can I move this?
Oh, just click it anywhere and drag it out.
All right. So again, Robert also mentioned about this, the meta-analysis. He cited gentleman from Dalhousie University, but also LVIC. So again, meta-analysis recognizes that cannabis might influence your impair your driving conditions, and therefore you are likely to have a crash. However, policies that regulate cannabis recreational use are only emerging, and therefore evidence to understand the impact is incipient at best. We have a conversation here with Christine, and we know essentially that there's a mixed studies, or the results are mixed. We have in this table some selection of studies that have been done in the last 7 years. And there's two things I would like to highlight here. There's one study recently published about Ontario, and they found no effect. And then there is a study in the United States and another one that we did in Uruguay, in which we actually found some, in the one that we did, we found some positive or some increasing in fatalities. And there was some, in particular in Colorado, that also provide information or evidence that after the legalization of recreational use, cannabis recreational use, you're likely to observe increases in fatalities. The commonality between these two studies that actually focus on urban settings. So that sort of guided, in a sense, the questions of this particular presentation, which is why we focus on Toronto particularly. In the case of Montevideo, we observe a heavy increase, and we didn't observe increases across Uruguay. And then what happens in Colorado, relative to other states, it was associated to increases in the number of cannabis stores. So those two elements actually push forward our research question. So there's three big challenges associated with mixed results: heterogeneity of the cannabis policies, different outcomes, and again, phenomena at the urban level may have its own dynamics. Heterogeneity of PCRU essentially means different countries regulate recreational use in different ways. And therefore, when we now analyze this type of policy, if we find certain similarities or differences, it might be because of the quality of the policy. In terms of the different outcomes, again, when we look at Colorado, when we look at Uruguay, we were studying fatalities. In both cases, however, it was total number of fatalities. Here's what we have, how it was the law implemented in Canada. And I appreciate one of two comments made by the reviewers when we submitted the presentation. So the reviewers say something like, yes, we understand that you introduce the variable to measure this particular type of policy in October, but Ontario actually had a specific event which occurred in April 2019. So we have 2 dates that should inform our analysis of the policy. And not only that, but also when you look into the norms, then you observe that Ontario actually was regulating the number of specific cannabis stores that should be implemented, which is something that you didn't observe in Uruguay, or you didn't observe per se in Colorado. And then the other thing that happens with us after the study, of course, this law, this act was challenged, and therefore Ontario changed the way in which cannabis store authorization or permissions were guaranteed. So essentially what we have here is two dates that should inform the implementation of this policy. And we argue that October 17 should be considered because maybe people were more susceptible to decrease their perception of cannabis being a substance that could affect their capabilities or the driving behaviors. So there is a change in the macro system that should be considered. But then you have April 2019 as a So recent studies in the cannabis consumption is diverse within Toronto, and therefore we need to be aware that there is a dynamic statistics, and therefore you could expect different outcomes within the city. And what we push as a hypothesis for us, when we observe the classification of districts, is all Toronto, Toronto is York, and York, which is, by the way, the district as they were defined by the police of Toronto, in which you will find increasing of cannabis vis-a-vis other districts. And therefore, we were expecting maybe an increase in traffic fatalities or traffic injuries in that particular district. Here we have the evolution of, the number of illegal and legal cannabis stores per 100,000 population. And at that time, Ontario didn't present overall compared to the rest of the provinces and the territories. We could say a problematic implementation of the policy. So what is the method we use? We use three methods, and this was to introduce quite a bit of rigorosity in the way we were analyzing our data. So we did interrupted time series, hybrid difference in difference, and hybrid ITS with facility DID. And then what data we used was number of crashes, all traffic injuries, and TSI, which is provided by the Toronto Police Service. This is open source. And then we were doing our own survey to identify when every single cannabis store was introduced within the city of Toronto. So we were making phone calls to every single cannabis store. We reached about 250, and they provided us information up until 190, something like that. And then, of course, as we all know, this is road safety. Temperature, snow, precipitation might have an effect in crash variation. So we collected all the information provided by Environment of Canada, and we introduced it in the model. The unit of analysis, this is important, is data information per city and per 4 district as defined by the Toronto Police Service, which are Toronto and East York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, and North York. That's how we're gonna have a model which we identify everything, but then we did a specific analysis per district. I'm gonna skip this. Again, essentially, this is just for us to understand that what we wanted to do was to identify whether the first event, which is October 18, had or not effect an association with the 3 outcomes. And then we also introduced the policy April 2019 to observe also an effect. This is the hybrid difference in difference, hybrid difference in difference. Essentially what we do in this case, we sort of switch the traditional approach, which is identifying a control group. And the control group in this case was the history of Toronto 2 years before. So we assume as if there was an absence of, clearly an absence of the intervention. And we compared those 2 years before when the intervention happened to see whether it was a change or not in the level or in the trend. And here is sort of what we claim can be the contribution for us, is whether the number of stores per capita actually had an association with traffic outcomes. So here's the 2 points. This is what we measure. We measure from 2016 up until the end of 2019. And we did so because, of course, we know the literature has indicated that after COVID, we have a change in the outcome, and therefore that should be measured differently. Here's the first result that we have. As you can see, there's an increment of cannabis store per capita, absolute number of cannabis store, and we then triangulated this with information provided by the cannabis store, Ontario Cannabis Retail. And it's relatively close to what we found, what we follow up. The advantage that we have here in this case, vis-a-vis what has informed by the Ontario Cannabis Retail, is that Ontario Cannabis Retail only informed of the 4th district in the last trimester. So here we have an evolution of per district. But as you could see, what we're interested, because we assume the intervention to end at the end of 2019, we have this as our main independent variable. Okay, it's not this, but this. So this will eventually should be useful to do other analysis after with COVID or after COVID. So here are the results. And what I want you to just take here, this is the ITS. There is no association whatsoever, regardless of the outcome. Regardless of traffic injury, regardless of crash, regardless of KCI, there's no association. And actually what we found in North York is a decreasing. So it seems like after the intervention, there was a decrease in the number of traffic injuries. And this is for October 2018. Here we have the second method. And here we observe a little bit more changes. And what we have here is again, North York being a preventive district, and there is a jump in Scarborough. And lastly, we did the analysis with our third method, and again, there is no association between the intervention, either the intervention in October or the intervention in April. And to test the hypothesis that we had, which was just concentrated in all Toronto, East York, and all victims, no association, even with in the increment, at least for 1 year of number of cannabis stores. So results are not sensitive to any method applied. Things like technical, we improve the confidence intervals by using number of cannabis stores per capita. So when we focus on North York and Scarborough, we were not certain about assuming either a preventive effect or a negative effect, because the way we framed the model was not associated with particular changes that might have happened in each of the districts. So in a sense, there's quite a bit of error there. What is the puzzle for us? No. Why did we find mostly null associations? I think the core here, it is because there was a low number of cannabis stores for the year in which we studied this. And we're basing this compared to the study done by Santana and Tenorio, in which they actually observed that changes begin when we observe that cannabis stores per capita are over 7. What can we study for next? We would like to study what's happening with the COVID. I know Evelyn and Christine are working with geo-reference data. That should be a good way to kind of be close to this question. And with that, I will end. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We do have some time for questions. If there are any from the audience. No questions? All right. Thank you, Jose.
Thank you for it.
Okay, our final speaker this afternoon is Michael Stewart. Michael is a community relations consultant for the Canadian Automobile Association group of companies, and is the largest CAA club and has been the CAA since 2018. He serves as the subject matter expert on a number of road safety files and is responsible for traffic safety education and awareness efforts. Michael holds degrees from Dalhousie University and the University of Ottawa, and brings his dedication and passion for road safety to various projects and partnerships across the province. Give us a couple minutes.
Testing. Oh, okay. Wow, it's so loud. Thank you. Oh, wow, you can just hear me talk to myself. Should be good. Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Michael Stewart, and I'm also very aware I am what's between you and the end of your day, so I will try and stick to my time. I want to move forward. There we go. Perfect. So just a little bit about us. So CAA has been advocating for traffic safety, mobility, transportation, infrastructure, and consumer protection since 1903. Today, with over 2 million members in Ontario, we continue to work in partnership with transportation experts like yourselves to make transportation safe and viable for our members. And we're always looking for opportunities to improve road safety through education and awareness, thought leadership, public policy, and strategic partnerships. So before I get into the research that I'm going to be presenting on, I just want to quickly highlight a few of our impaired driving efforts. In 2018, we launched our Don't Drive High campaign. And this was essentially raising awareness on the effects that cannabis can have on your ability to drive, including reaction time and depth perception. In 2019, we partnered with the Ontario Provincial Police on a series to address myths and misconceptions on impaired driving. We actually took the Facebook comments from our Don't Drive High campaign and addressed them in a video with Sergeant Carrie Schmidt in kind of a Jimmy Kimmel's mean tweet style video. In 2020, our national office launched a Do Anything But Drive campaign focusing on edibles and Gen Z and targeting Gen Z. And it was basically just trying to raise awareness that edibles do affect your ability to drive and do have that delayed effect kicking in. So just if you're going to do edibles, do whatever you want to do in the safety of your own home. Just do anything but drive. And in 2021, we partnered with police to share road safety messaging ahead of the holiday season. And this year we have a couple potential campaigns in the works. It's just still very early on in the year. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is our drug-impaired driving survey that we conducted from September 22nd to October 5th. We surveyed 1,500 Ontario licensed drivers to measure their perceptions on the dangers and frequency of impaired driving, gauge awareness about different types of cannabis being used, and evaluate public level of comfort with legal and illegal substances. There will be some comparisons to a 2019 survey throughout. We try and do this survey annually, but with 2020 being 2020, we did not do a survey that year. So first, behaviors and consumption. So at the time of this survey, we had 1 in 5 Ontario drivers had consumed cannabis in the past 3 months, and 44% had ever tried cannabis. We also had 5% who had tried illegal substances in the past 3 months, and 18% had ever tried. So just those terms will come up again. So current users, past 3 months at the time of survey, lapsed users are 4+ months. And then of course, non-users have never used cannabis or illegal drugs. And just lastly, of that 1/5 of Ontario drivers who are current users, half of them are consuming weekly or more often. And in terms of where these folks are consuming, not surprisingly, given the pandemic, when they thought about the last year, at home alone was the most popular consumption location, followed closely by at home with their spouse or family member. And then in third was at a friend or family member's house. So I'm not too surprised to see a dip in a lot of the locations, such as vacation, concert, sporting event, all of those had dips. For 2021, again, with all the measures, that's not too surprising. And according to our survey, solid edibles are rising in popularity post-legalization, which, not too surprising, as edibles do kind of give that different experience that people might be more comfortable trying, eating instead of smoking. And edibles have now become the most preferred method of consumption among current users, overtaking joints, which had the top spot in 2019. To us, edibles being the most common consumption method does have interesting challenges to it, especially when it comes to enforcement. They're not as obvious if you take them, so they don't have that same distinct smell as, say, smoking a joint, and also a bit easier to disguise in the vehicle. As well, awareness of their effects isn't as well known, so some people might not realize that it could take up to 2 hours to reach those full effects. And we also asked about poly use, and 2 in 5 current cannabis users are poly users, with the 40% combining alcohol and cannabis. Some people combine their cannabis with ecstasy, some people with prescription painkillers, and then just over half solely take cannabis. Next, perceptions of impaired driving. So overall, concerns about impaired driving have increased since 2019, up 10% from our last survey. Cannabis-impaired driving is now viewed as being just as concerning as driving under the influence of legal drugs, and is pretty closely closing that gap with alcohol-impaired driving. The proportion of those who are very concerned about their personal safety when it comes to cannabis-impaired driving is also much lower amongst younger folks. And the majority of Ontario drivers, 89%, agree that driving under the influence of cannabis is a serious road safety risk. But not surprising, the proportion is much lower among cannabis-impaired drivers, so those who have admitted to driving after consuming cannabis, which is at 69% strongly or somewhat agreeing. And something that was a bit concerning to us is when you looked at those aged 19 to 34, they were less likely to believe that cannabis is a serious road safety risk, with only 63% of that age group agreeing to that statement, the lowest of any other age group. We also asked about cannabis in relation to alcohol or other drugs, in which they thought was more dangerous when combined with driving. As you can see, cannabis is either perceived equally or less dangerous across the board, with respondents believing that alcohol-impaired driving or illegal substances in driving are more dangerous than cannabis, which I kind of find interesting because just 2 slides ago, we saw that the level of concern was the same pretty much across the board. And then we also asked about perceptions of edible cannabis. And even though more people were more likely to think that edible cannabis is more dangerous when driving, smoking was still perceived as the most dangerous form of cannabis consumption before getting behind the wheel. And compared to 2019, a higher proportion of those who have previously driven under the influence of cannabis believe that cannabis has either no effect on their driving ability or in fact improves their driving ability. Probably not a surprise that some people do, that those folks would believe that. But to see that this has gone up 7% since 2019 is a bit alarming. And again, when looking at younger drivers, 1 in 5 young drivers believe that a cannabis-impaired driver drives better or the same as a sober driver. We did ask them about their awareness of penalties in Ontario. Only half were aware that the penalties for drug-impaired driving mirror those of alcohol-impaired driving. 25% just didn't know. And then we had about almost 1/5 who thought alcohol impaired driving still has more severe penalties. We also saw that 4%, 4% of drivers had actually been charged with impaired driving. So they admitted to that in this survey, and 7% admitted to being suspected at a ride stop check. What was a bit of an alarming number for me was 36% of Ontario drivers know someone who has been charged with impaired driving, which seems scarily high, at least, or in my opinion at least. And then awareness of zero tolerance. Most people are aware that young and novice drivers have a zero tolerance rule in Ontario, but only about half are aware that commercial drivers have that same rule. Do you want me to remove me? Yeah, I think that. I'll actually click on this. There we are. So impaired driving behaviors, and this is my last section. So while most drivers haven't driven under the influence, yay, in the past 3 months at the time of this survey, we did have 6% of drivers who had consumed cannabis and got behind the wheel, or about 497,000 drivers in Ontario. That proportion is similar to 2019, so there's not a huge behavior change there. And then when we looked at ever, that was about 14% of Ontario drivers, or approximately 1.2 million, who had ever consumed cannabis and got behind the wheel. Actually, before my next slide, I just want to reiterate that point that the percentage of drivers has stayed the same from 2019 to 2021, so 6%, or almost 500,000 drivers who had driven after consuming cannabis in the past 3 months. And when we asked them more specific questions, we had 2/3 of cannabis-impaired drivers that were confident in their driving ability, but this was actually a decrease from 2019. And of those who felt very or somewhat confident, 33% felt very or somewhat high, which is an increase from 2019. So according to our survey, we have about the same amount of people who are driving after consuming cannabis, but they are feeling less confident behind the wheel and they are feeling more high, which are two things you really don't want to hear. And 69% of those who had driven a vehicle and consumed cannabis drove within 3 hours or less of consumption. And as we all know, the effects of cannabis can take, specifically edibles, can take some time to fully kick in and can last for some time after that. So it can take up to 2 hours, depending on your edible, to fully feel those effects. The fact that so many are driving even under 2 hours after consumption is alarming. And then when we broke down the type of cannabis being consumed before driving, a joint was still the most common, but solid edibles had the most significant increase amongst cannabis-impaired drivers. It was up 7% from 2019. And we also see on the right, we asked how much they had consumed before driving. So with smoking or vaping, it was usually about a few hits. But then when we went down to edibles, we asked how much THC was in those edibles that they were taking. And over half have been consuming at least 10 milligrams of THC. And as you might know, at least 10 milligrams of THC, you start to feel strong euphoria effects and you start to alter your coordination and your perceptions, which are both things that you need intact when driving. And that is all for me. I told you I'd be quick. There we are. If you have any more more information about what we do, you can check out our website and then my email's there as well if you have any questions that come up after the conference. Thank you.
Any questions for Michael? Questions at the back there? Michael, was there anything in your participant survey that you asked what type of commercial versus automobile versus public two-wheeler?
Unfortunately, no, not that I would have to double check on that one. So I know we do ask them if they own or lease a vehicle. I don't believe we get down as specific as the vehicle type. Sorry about that. Thank you, Christine.
One of the questions I've had is you've got a lot of so much information in the surveys. Somebody who likes to analyze survey data, I get really excited looking at this. But did you look at whether or not amongst cannabis users, did certain attitudes, were they related to certain outcomes? So for example, if you were somebody who thought that you were unlikely to be caught, or if you were somebody who thought, oh, it's not a big deal, I'm not going to get into a crash, were you somebody who was more likely to engage in cannabis-impaired driving?
We didn't ask that for this survey, but since you've made the plug, we are conducting the same survey this year, and we're actually going to be asking some of those questions. So if people who were driving after consumption, we're asking them, did they feel like so why do they do it? Do they feel like they were going to get caught when doing it? And when asking them about, does cannabis make them a better driver or a worse driver, what specifics in there? So does driving under the influence of cannabis, does it make you drive slower? Does it make you focus more? We want to try and do a bit more of a deep dive into that. So I'd be happy to share those with you after the fact. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Just to conclude, we have a donation card here for all our speakers. So Curtis will be giving the young professionals committee giving a donation to the young professionals committee. So I'll be handing these out to support speakers. Don't forget that we have the welcoming reception starting at 6:30 over next door in the area. So we'll see you all there.